And so this is the profound aha. So what does that mean, you have little faith? Who did they have little faith in? They had little faith in God. But whom did they have faith in? Jesus. So they had little faith in God, but they had profound faith in Jesus because they thought he could save them. Yeah. And so then it's just Jesus helping them to understand that it's not just about faith in him, which is pretty great that they had faith in him, but that he was a representation of the Father.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Midweek. My guest this week is Mark Marten, and he is not only one of our elders here at Life Point Church, which many of you know, but what some of you may not know is he is also UMBC's, I want to get this correct, you are the department chair of UMBC's Department of Chemical, Biochemical, and Environmental Engineering. That's a long title.
Perfect.
Yeah. I'm glad I got it right. Thank you so much for being here on this episode of Midweek. Really glad to have you here.
Happy to be here.
Always enjoy our conversations. Because you're in this role and you're an elder, but you also are a professor, I really want to kind of dive into your area of expertise. And so not to kind of like oversimplify a whole life's worth of research and teaching, but you spent most of your career researching filamentous fungi. Did I say that right?
Perfect, yeah.
And for the layperson like myself, essentially mold, right?
That's exactly right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so when you're, I'm always interested in like how people get into their field. And so I think of like being a kid and wanting to, be a police officer, or I wanted to be a football player, or I wanted to be a Ninja Turtle. There was a point where you're like, mold, that's it for me. So what was it about mold that you were like, yeah, I want to spend a life researching that? And maybe what is something about mold that somebody like me wouldn't know? Like most of us try to avoid that or get rid of it in our house. So you're pursuing that. What is it about mold that was like, yeah, I want to pursue that?
Yeah, so I don't know if when I first thought about doing science, I thought about fungi. My interest evolved there, and I can explain that in a second. But it started when I was in high school, actually. So it was a long time ago. And the world's first recombinant DNA product had just become commercially available, and it was human insulin. So before that, they had to use insulin from pigs or cows, which worked for many people that were diabetic. But for others, they were allergic to that, and it caused all kinds of challenges and problems. So Eli Lilly was able to make human insulin, so take a gene for insulin and put it into bacteria, and then make human insulin in bacteria, which is really cool, right? And so now you can give people human insulin and there's no allergic response like there would be to porcine or bovine insulin.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I wrote a term paper on that when I was a senior in high school.
Really?
That was 1982.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that was the world's first commercial biotech product. And then a fun aspect of that story is that I went to grad school at Purdue, which is just north of Indianapolis where Eli Lilly has its headquarters. And so in a field trip for one of my classes, we visited the human insulin production facility. And so I got to see them actually doing the process that really motivated me to study biotechnology when I was in high school, that got me going.
Wow.
Yeah. And so then in grad school, I studied yeast. Yeast are also fungi, and you use yeast to make beer and bake bread. But they're also, and so this is a term I'll use, they're model organisms. And so there are a number of model organisms that people study, and the reason why you study a model organism is because there's already a lot known about it. And so instead of relearning the basic things, we can keep going deeper and deeper and deeper to learn more and more about the way the cell functions. And so we study a model organism, it is filamentous fungi. Yeast are little spheres. The ones we grow are like long hair-like hyphae. And so why would someone actually invest energy in that? So I think there's a couple of reasons. Fungi are prevalently involved in the biotech industry. I used to work at a company called Novozymes, the world's largest enzyme manufacturing company. And there's enzymes in so many products you just would never think about. I used to make enzymes that went into laundry detergent. and then in food products and all kinds of other commercial products. So hundreds of millions of dollars of enzymes are manufactured. And so if we understand how fungi work and grow, we can make those processes better. So in a sense, make more money.
Yeah.
The other reason why fungi are super interesting, because there's some bad guys, if you will, there's pathogens. And fungal pathogens are responsible for billions of dollars of crop losses every year, and hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of loss in human health. And so I guess the idea is if we understand the fundamental aspect for how fungi grow and operate, we can then apply that in two different areas, right? We can apply that to make better products, and we can then help human health. And I tell my students, really, almost all research is driven by one of three things: money, health, or defense. And so we got two of the three covered. So there's no fungi in warfare, although maybe at the end we could talk a little bit about how that might be the case. But yeah. Wow.
And so that's started in high school, and then throughout college. I mean, that passion just grew.
Yeah, right. So I got a job at Novozymes. So I did a postdoc at NC State, and in my postdoc, we were trying to understand how to make cellulase. And so cellulase is an enzyme which breaks down cellulose. The idea is that you could then make ethanol from sawdust.
Wow.
Or corn stalks. And so it was funded through National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL. And so fungi are the world's best enzyme producers. And so that's where it started. And then we ran out of money. And so then I got this job at Novozymes. And so I worked growing fungi and studying fungi in a process environment for a couple of years. And then realized I loved working there. It was a great job, fantastic people, but I really wanted to work with students. And so then in 1996 came to UMBC, and I guess I had this background already in growing fungi and studying them and how they operate. And so my research focus I've been doing this for 25 years now, has evolved over time to go farther and farther back in the process. And so when I first started, we were studying how they grow in big tanks, and there's a lot of hydrodynamics and mixing and kind of engineering aspects to that. And now we do a lot of biotech stuff, so recombinant DNA technology and systems biology to understand the real fundamental workings of the cell. So when I talk to students, I say, the cell is like a factory. And just like a factory, it has all kinds of different processes. It doesn't want to have all those turned on at the same time. That wouldn't be a smart move. And so it has control mechanisms. Some things are turned on when they're needed. Some things are turned off when they're not needed. So how does a cell make decisions, if you will? This doesn't have a brain, but what's the control software that turns things on and turns things off? In a cell that's not coding, but it's gene regulatory networks. But it's a little bit like computer code that controls things. So what we do with the fundamental aspect of our research is try to understand how that software works. How does a cell turn things on and turn things off? And the general premise is if we can understand and reverse engineer the software, the control systems, we can hack it. So we can make good cells better, and we can kill the bad cells.
Wow.
We can wreck the pathogens.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, thanks.
You've spent a life research and in scientific study, but faith has also been a big part of your story as well.
Yeah.
Have you ever had to navigate that tension, or is that tension something that exists? Is this something that you've had to navigate personally as you've gone throughout your career?
Yeah, that's a great question. Not really.
Yeah.
Not really. For me, again, there's all kinds of different nuances here, but I haven't experienced a personal tension with it at all. For me, science explains how the world works, natural phenomena, and that's what I study. I study genes and how they do things in cells, right? For me, my faith explains how people work and how God works and our relationship between God and people. And so I think that possibly one could imagine there's a conflict with the whole creation evolution thing. But I haven't experienced that either, to be honest with you. So maybe 20 years ago, I spent a lot of time thinking about intelligent design. And again, we could talk about this for a long time, but I made a decision to stop spending time studying that because I was more interested in studying spiritual transformation. And time is a zero-sum game, right? You only have 168 hours a week.
Yeah.
And I get to choose how I spend that time. Now, I definitely study science, right? I do my research, and I spend huge amounts of time on that. But I don't have a sense that there's a conflict there.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
What came first for you? Was it your interest in God or your interest in science?
Wow, that's a great question, too. They both evolved simultaneously. So when I was in high school, we went to Catholic church. And I think when I was in 10th grade, my mom, told me I had to go to a retreat. And I said, I'm not going. And I had no interest in faith. But she said, you're going to go. And so I went, and I had a great time because of relationship. And that's a theme that I've observed through my whole life. It's all about relationship.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I was super interested in spiritual things, but I was very interested in the relationships. And that pulled me into being interested in spiritual things. And then that was when I was a sophomore. I think when I was a senior in high school, I met some other students that were in that group that were really Christ followers.
Yeah.
And they explained to me what was involved. And I think when I was probably spring semester of my senior year in high school, I really believed that Jesus was God and that he died for my sins. And that's when I made that faith commitment.
Yeah.
And at the same time, that's when I was writing that's that same semester I was writing the term paper about human insulin. Right. So that's when my science interest was being sparked. And I just thought recombinant DNA technology, biotechnology was the coolest thing ever. And I wasn't really sure how to do that. I was also pretty good at math. And so so I think I was interested in biology, but biochemical engineering is what really seemed to be interesting to me because of the math involved and the quantitative aspect of it. So I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
So I think they both kind of came together at the same time.
Yeah. You talk about how relationships were really the thing that pulled you or pushed you forward in investigating faith. And I would imagine that the same was true for your career as well, that there are relationships or maybe mentors that you had. I read a quote recently from David Brooks, and he said, humans we're good at learning. We're pretty decent at learning, but we're wonderful at imitating. So who are the people, both kind of like in your career and in your spiritual formation, that were kind of heroes that you wanted to imitate, or were there any?
Yeah, so I had, my PhD advisor was a guy named Jin-Ho So. He was a Korean guy, and he was wonderful, right? So I think it's kind of like when you remember so much from when you're a child, right? When you're a kid, you're just like a sponge, you soak everything up. And so that's really where I got started. And so he was a fantastic role model. It's pretty common to do a postdoctoral research, and so a postdoc. And so my postdoc advisor was amazingly impactful in my career. His name was David Alice. He was really one of the founders of the chemical engineering biotechnology movement. And the book that everybody learned from was Bailey and Alice. And so I got a job in Dave's lab. This was, it's a long time ago, 94 to 96. And he was, it's amazing to think about this. When I worked for Dave, he was my age now.
Wow.
Yeah, that's weird. I hadn't thought about that. And Dave was just fantastic because he had 5 kids, and he had just adopted a daughter, international adoption, which is cool because we've done that too. And Dave was he was a real human, and very personable, yet super hardcore science guy. And so I just love that melding of having a real life, but being serious about the science he was doing, and brilliant scientist. Thinking about faith, there's been a ton of role models. So when I was at Purdue in grad school, the guy who was the Crew campus director was Carl Clayton. And then when I was an undergrad at Buffalo, the guy who was the Crew campus director was John Mansfield. I'm still in contact with these guys. They discipled me. They worked with me. They told me the things that were hard for me to hear because they cared enough about me to tell me these things. And then Joe Duke is another spiritual mentor. I could talk about Joe for hours. I think another spiritual mentor, so it's a weird thing because like I know him, but he doesn't know me, right? So I've talked about him so many times when I've done sermons up front, is Dallas Willard. Mm-hmm. And so I think he's my hero because he was a department chair. I mean, he's in philosophy, right? So it wasn't quantitative science, but he was an academic. And but he was so profoundly influential for so many people in really, from my perspective, bringing the idea of spiritual transformation back into the discussion in such a profound and meaningful way.
Yeah.
That before that, spiritual disciplines were really a backward area of faith. But they've been practiced for thousands of years. But in writing a couple books and then working with Richard Foster and others, they really brought that back on the scene as the mechanism or means by which we can achieve this amazing connection, the with God life.
Yeah.
And I'm getting emotional just talking about it. It's been that dramatically meaningful in my life.
Yeah. I'm curious if there is any difference or any similarity between thinking scientifically and thinking theologically. So how we approach science and how we approach God in the way that we think.
Yes, I think a lot about critical thinking. So what does that mean? I think it starts with observation. And one of the challenges is people are not patient these days. And I think our media has evolved in a way that's made us impatient. I mean, think about TikTok or YouTube Shorts or even YouTube videos. Or Facebook. You scroll through and it's the thumb scroll, right? And so we want things instantaneously. Mm-hmm. And so we've lost our ability to think about something deeply and patiently. And that's tragic. I have a story that I make all my new undergrads read. It's called The Student, the Fish, and Agassiz. And if people want to, it's a 3-page article from the 1850s, but you can read it. It's on my website. But it's all about sitting in a process to really deeply think about it. And that's a learned skill that nobody knows anymore, right? And I'm being very big there, but few people do that well. So I think learning how to observe things, to sit in something is really important. So how can one do that spiritually? So again, this is not practiced commonly, but I think scripture memorization is huge. And it's not to memorize the Bible as a weapon or as a response. Memorization is a way to think about things deeply, right? So if you have it in your head, you can bring it back into your mind and ruminate on it, right? So it provides us an opportunity to think about things in such a deep and meaningful way that outside of memorization, I'm not sure how that's really possible, right? So thinking about critical thinking and the difference between science and theology, critical thinking begins with observation. I think the second thing is making connections, right? And if you think about things and have a lot of observation, you can start to make deep connections that otherwise would be very difficult to do. And then logical consequences. So one thing, I had an aha moment. I love aha moments. Thinking about the disciples in the boat with Jesus when he was in the storm, right? And for me, maybe a lot of people have thought of this. For me, it was an aha moment when I thought about it. They were scared. Many people know the story. It's a huge storm. Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat, and the disciples are freaked out because they're fishermen. So how much more profound is that? The guys who live on the water are freaked out by the water, okay? And Jesus is asleep, right? So what does that say about him, right? So he was relaxed. And so they woke him up and said, save us, save us. And he said, oh, you have little faith. And so this is the profound aha. So what does that mean, you have little faith? Who did they have little faith in? They had little faith in God. But whom did they have faith in? Jesus. So they had little faith in God, but they had profound faith in Jesus because they thought he could save them.
Yeah.
And so then it's just Jesus helping them to understand that it's not just about faith in him, which is pretty great that they had faith in him, but that he was a representation of the Father. He was the nature of the Father. And so for me, that was an aha moment. And that's again, coming back to the idea, what's similar between science and theology? It's critical thinking, I think, and deep observation, that is followed by connecting things
Yeah.
and thinking about them in a new way that leads to these aha moments.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we either impose the scientific method on the Bible or we impose theology on science. And so where do we kind of critically make that mistake when either we approach the Bible or we approach a scientific discovery by we use the Bible to interpret one thing or we use science to interpret the Bible? Where do we go wrong there?
Yeah, that's a great question. So science in principle is pretty simple, right? You have some history of observation, use that to make a hypothesis. I think this is going to happen. And then you do an experiment and you test it and you look for reproducibility. And the eventual goal is a predictive model. So what that means, so flight simulator is a great example of this. It's a predictive model for how an airplane works. And I've talked to pilots who say, yeah, so when you're in a full-blown simulator, it is really similar, like almost transparently similar to being in an airplane.
Wow.
And that's because we know how wind works and how airplanes work, and we know the science behind it, right? So it's experimentation, predictive model. But if you think about this, the Bible is not reproducible, right? So you can't apply the scientific method. It's historical.
Yeah.
And so, but there's a great precedent for this, which is our court system, right? So we look at history, and we can say, yeah, this did happen or didn't happen in history. So I think historical observation, reproducibility is not part of that.
Right.
But it's driven by evidence. And so I think that when we confuse the scientific method, which is reproducibility, with historical evidentiary approach to proving things, that's where we make a mistake. And you can't, the Bible is not a scientific book.
Yeah.
It was never intended to be a scientific. God didn't intend for it to be a scientific book. It's a book that helps us understand our relationship with God. And science doesn't explain that, our relationship with each other or with God, right? So they each have their own lane in a way. And I think when we put them in the same lane, that's when we have challenges.
Yeah. Yeah, and for me, I think about what must it have been like to be Moses, right? So I think it's easy to just assume my own context. I'm kind of the center of my own universe. And so I go in reading the Bible and think I impose my own kind of cultural standards and just the things that we take for granted, kind of our social imaginary. And I impose that on somebody like Moses. But then I have to step back and say, how would God reveal himself to somebody in that cultural context thousands of years before my own? And so here's a guy, Moses, who doesn't own an iPad or an iPhone. He doesn't know anything about climate change or, he has no context of the things that I take for granted, even the way that we keep time. Like there's just things that don't translate. So how would God communicate the beginning of the universe and the beginning of creation and kind of a brief human history up to Moses's point in a way that Moses would understand?
Brilliant. I love that. Absolutely love that. And I totally agree with that, right? So it had to be in a context that the people of the day could kind of wrap their brains around. Let me also give you some accolades, because I think that's a great practice, what you're talking about. I think that oftentimes people read the Bible and see biblical figures and just think they were superheroes. And I think that's not good. I think that what you're doing is using imagination. Imagine yourself as those people, because they were real people.
Yeah.
They had shortfalls all over the place, right? And imagining yourself in their scenario, like imagining the boat, being in the boat with the disciples, imagining being scared in a storm, and really using your imagination to fill in all the details that are around what we know from the text. What was it cold? How bad was the rain? Was the rain sideways? With Moses, what did the burning bush look like? How big was it? Were there sheep around too, right? So using our imaginations puts us into those scenarios in such a real and meaningful way that I think it really helps us to learn in a much deeper way from the things that God has to tell us through the Word.
Yeah. Yeah, and earlier you talked about discovering things that people had yet to discover, that there's still so much left to discover. And in a time when it feels like our world is getting smaller and smaller, there's still so much to discover. And especially once you get a microscope onto something, you realize just how much or how little you actually know. And I feel like that's the same experience I've had with the Bible as well, is that the more I get microscopic, the more microscopic I get, the less I understand, and the more there is to discover. And so what I love about kind of a biblical discovery is that you can't exhaust it. It is inexhaustible. I mean, there are guys who have lived their whole lives researching, studying the Bible, and still come up with new insight or receive new insight. And I just think that that's fascinating. To be able to put yourself on the boat, well, that's a completely different level of insight. And if you're willing, like you said, to patiently kind of observe and, okay, what's going on, to think about the rain. Is it coming in sideways? Is it cold? Is it warm? Does it feel humid outside? Those all add to the interpretation. It all adds to the understanding. So I love just how multi-layered that discovery is. And that's I think for us as a community, that's one of the exciting things that we get to do together, is go on that process of discovery together and realize how little we know sometimes.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, that's really good. We talked a little bit about the tension between science and faith, and how you've navigated that personally. Have you ever, you said that it hasn't really been a tension for you personally, but professionally, like has that ever been something you've walked colleagues or students through? Has that been a tension that you've seen in others that you've helped them navigate?
Yeah, so lots of parts of that question have different answers, I think. So I guess I haven't really experienced any challenging scenarios because of my faith. And so part of that is because, I teach a class on how to build chemical reactors, right? So honestly, religion or faith doesn't come up very often.
Yeah.
I prefaced my class the very first day. I say to students, I hope to get to know you as people as we go through the class. That, I don't want you just to be a number or a name on a piece of paper. I want to get to know you. It's hard to do in a class of 50 people, but I'm going to try. And I hope you can get to know me a little bit. But if that's true, then the most important thing about me is I'm a Christ follower. Yeah. And so what that means is that I try to live according to the things that Jesus said we're supposed to do, and I don't always succeed at that, but I try hard. So what that means for this class is I'll do my best to be a person of integrity, to help you the best I can, and to be empathetic when there's challenges that come up, because there always are. And I'd love to talk to you more if that's something that's of interest. And so that's pretty much it. I have had on occasion people that say they're frustrated that I say that, but it's pretty rare.
Yeah.
So more often than not, students at the end of the semester often don't find this out until the end. They'll write on their comments in the evaluations that, thank you for saying that, I'm a believer too. I have had lots of scenarios where I'm talking to either students or other faculty, and life is hard.
Yeah.
Right? And so we'll talk about the hard aspects of life, and a lot of it is personal stuff, and I'll do my best to listen and to hear what they're saying, and then I often will offer to pray for people. And I don't think anyone has ever turned me down. And so I'll say, can I pray for you? And they say, yeah, sure. And I say, right now? And they're like, sure, I guess so. And I'll say a prayer about their scenario, their situation. And I don't remember any situation everyone has ever turned me down, and I don't remember any time anybody's not said thank you.
Yeah.
So I think that there are ways to bring faith into the conversation, and I think there's a number of other times. So I've had a number of graduate students who are believers over the past, and so we talk a lot about faith. And so there I can bring in, how do you think God views this, or this is a challenging situation, and talk about, and we pray for their research. I do that with some faculty sometimes. But I'm a firm believer that the only mind you can change is your own. And so I want to be, Matthew 5:16 maybe, let your light shine before men in such a way that they may glorify your Father in heaven. See your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So I want to be the best, most helpful person I can be for others. And then I want to share about God when it's appropriate to do that. And I will try to be provocative to the point that it's reasonable. And I guess, I don't know, it's judgment call, when to bring it up and how aggressively to bring it up. But I try to bring it up, and I have shared the gospel with many students and faculty.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
If as humans we're wonderful at imitating, you'd want to be the person worth imitating, right? So it's kind of knowing that is an opportunity that you have, is to be the type of person that you'd want to model others, for others. And so I love that. Have you ever had, whether it's here at LifePoint or even at UMBC, somebody say, hey, I recently read this, or here's this conflict. Now I'm not so sure that I believe in God because of, now I read something about how humans, we've actually been around for 100,000 years, and there's the, young Earth and old Earth and all that. Have you ever had to walk through conversations with people who maybe they thought, well, this article or this book has really challenged my faith, and now I'm not so sure if I believe in God? Or
very rarely, much more rarely than I would think if I hadn't lived it.
Yeah.
It's surprisingly rarely. And that actually fascinates me. So I teach Starting Point. So Starting Point is this opportunity for people that are either seekers, starters, or returners, people that are seeking God, starting their relationship with God, or returning to faith. And it's a fantastic opportunity. It's small groups. It's really about discussion. It's a class, but not really a class. It's really a discussion. And I've been doing it for many years now. I think maybe 10 years ago, we used to have the whole creation evolution thing as part of the curriculum. And we used to talk a lot about apologetics, so answers to tough questions. The curriculum has changed significantly, but I still do this at the beginning of every Starting Point class. I ask people to write down their top questions about Christianity or faith. And so on 3x5 cards. And usually they fill the 3x5 cards. They have many questions. And it's astounding to me, nobody asks about science. Nobody. And I think people just don't think about it as much as they used to.
Yeah.
I don't know if I really understand all the questions about relationship.
Yeah.
How can a good God allow bad things to happen to good people, right? And how does God manage this type of scenario? Or why did this happen to me? Or why do good people die of cancer? All those type of questions are very common, right? But nobody asks about science or deep theology.
Yeah.
Very rarely, yeah.
And that, I had talked about how, when I was in my early 20s, that had been more of the conversation. And it seemed like, that was a conversation I was having more and more frequently. And you said that was part of the Starting Point curriculum, but then there was the shift. Do you know what caused that shift? Do you have any opinion, or what changed in the conversation? Do we just socially we're like, yeah, that's not a hang up for us anymore? Yeah,
that's a great question. I think smarter men than me have struggled to answer that question. I just grow fungus. If I was going to just wildly speculate, I think it might be a couple things, right? It might be that we have really entered a full-blown post-Christian era, right? I think another thing might be the fact that sentiments have changed dramatically in the last 10 years, right? So this is a different world we live in than we lived in 10 years ago. Yeah. And there are so many manifestations of that. Just one trivial manifestation that's in my world, nobody reads books. Nobody reads books. And so what I mean by that is my students, it's really hard for me to get my students to read the textbook. They don't. Often they don't. There's always, a contingent. There's 10%, 50% that are hardcore and will do a great job reading the book. I have to try to convince them that reading the book is a valuable exercise. And so for me, that has nothing to do with this. It's really just an outcome or a manifestation of this new world order that we're in. The world is a different place, and people, and so what do? They want to watch videos, and I think that's been driven by Facebook and the context of social media that many people live in. Right? I'm a dinosaur. Right? I'm pre-social media, and so I'm not as I grew up with books. Right? So it's hard for me to understand that mindset, but I have to, and I've had to adjust the way I teach classes and the way I help students learn, because it's foolish to just think, well, just do it my way. Yeah. That's simplistic and ridiculous, right? So it's trying to figure out how to manage through this new way that people think.
Yeah. Well, and in a way too, I mean, I think it's, that's progress, because those questions of, well, why do good things happen to bad people? And if God is good, then why is there evil in the world? They're actually healthier questions than the questions or the tension between science and faith, because we're really talking about the character of God at that point. And that's something that we can actually go through the Bible and say, well, this is God's character. And there is a space that we have to be also cognizant and comfortable with mystery. You know, there is, that's where we can't impose science on faith and on theology, because there are some things that are mysterious, and we keep asking. They're just the good questions to ask, but we may not have an answer.
Yeah.
And so I think those are great questions that you address in Starting Point, and great questions that have been coming up through Starting Point. And I think they're the questions that you're more likely to get in the office, around the water cooler. You know, if you build a relationship with somebody at work, they know that you go to church, or that faith is a part of your life. Like, it's that kind of soul question that's probably more important, or more like you'd rather address that. Like, okay, that's coming from a place. You have some background where you're asking that question, and that opens up the relationship more than just, what's your opinion on flat Earth, or or old Earth, or new Earth. And so I think that's great. As we kind of wrap up, I'm curious, what are some scientific discoveries or developments that excite you most as a follower of Jesus?
So I talked earlier about how the cell is like a factory, and there's all these systems that control the factory. That's very fundamental research. Fundamental research is things that is maybe 20 years away from being applied. Okay, so we also do very applicable research, and that's maybe translational research or developmental research. And so we're trying to apply the fundamental learning to something that's really cool. We want to create the world's replacement for plastic. We want to solve the world's plastic problem.
Sounds pretty easy, right?
Yeah. So there's.
And you said earlier, because we were talking about it earlier, how much plastic is there in the world?
Yeah, so 402 million tons of plastic, virgin plastic, petroleum-based plastic manufactured every year, none of which is biodegradable, and only a tiny fraction of which is recycled.
We think it all gets recycled.
Yeah, almost none. So
Wow.
I think less than 10%, or on the order of 10%.
Wow.
Very small fraction. Even stuff you throw in a recycling bin often gets incinerated or wasted. It doesn't get recycled.
Wow.
And so there's been a ton of studies on this. Plastic persists for a long time, and now I have a paper. It's even in the remotest areas of the earth. It makes its way around the globe. And so how can we solve that problem? Well, one way is to degrade the existing plastic, and there are other people, very good people, smart people working on that. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to create a replacement. And so how do you do that? Well, we think that we can use cells and make cellular-based materials that are a replacement for many plastic materials. Not all, but many. And so the idea is that cells are much less expensive to grow. they're eminently sustainable, right? You can grow more, and they're eminently recyclable, right? So cells can break down over time. And so if we use cells instead of petroleum-based plastic in some applications, it would replace plastics. I think it would be cheaper and more sustainable. Great alternative.
And is that like really only commercial use, or is that, do you see from like the plastic detergent, laundry detergent bottle that I have, like, is there a residential kind of use as well? Is it mainly industrial plastics?
Great question. There actually are commercial products right now that you can buy, and I think they're great examples of what could be. So one commercial product is a replacement for leather, and I've actually seen this. It's made from filamentous fungi, and it looks and feels like leather.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's commercially available today.
Wow.
Yeah. Other things are more less kind of exotic or close to people. So building materials, packing materials, things like foam, packing peanuts, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I think the sky's the limit. So what our research, what we're doing is not necessarily developing commercial products, but understanding how to tune the cell genetically.
Yeah.
And the idea is if you tune the cell genetically, you can get different cellular outcomes so that when you put those cells into materials, they'd have different material properties, mechanical properties. And to make a connection between the genetics, and so phenotype is what the cells look like, and then mechanical properties with cells. And we actually want to use very sophisticated, we talked about this a little earlier too, machine learning approaches, so artificial intelligence, to pull together genetic changes that lead to mechanical property changes in materials. So we're still at the fundamental aspect of material design, which could then possibly be applied. There's actually another very an impending popular product. So Bill Gates was on 60 Minutes talking about a company that he's invested in heavily. It's called Nature's Find, FYND, and it's using fungi as food.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so fungi have been used for food for many years. And people say, oh, it's so gross, but you can't tell they're fungi. They don't look like fungi. And it's a protein source, essentially. But the next level of that, there's another company that's working on creating meat alternatives. So the Impossible Burger is an example that, I've had one of those. It doesn't taste like plants to me. It kind of tastes like a Whopper, right? So,
yeah.
And it looks like meat. So the next level of that is to make actual meat material that looks like a slab of chicken or a slab of beef.
Wow.
But it's made from cells that are not beef or chicken.
Wow.
And this is coming. It's coming. And the idea being that you can develop the way the material is produced, the mycelial material is produced, in a way that you really couldn't tell the difference.
Yeah.
If you can tell the difference, then it's not a great replacement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have loads of questions, and this might just be for me personally and not for the episode. But so as far as the replacing plastic, how do you keep something stable enough to work for as long as you need it to, and then know when it's supposed to break down? Like, is there, I'm imagining that's part of the research of like how, if you're going to keep this as a product for 20 years, will it break down before that, or will it break down when we want it to? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the applications where you can use it effectively will be varied and different, and it will depend. And so I don't think, like I said, water bottles, I don't think you'd make a mycelial material water bottle. So I don't know if I really know the answer to that question. I think so. But the thoughts that come to mind are, you can think out loud about this. So you have a long filamentous cell. You could functionalize the outside of that. You could make composite materials. So maybe the underlaying material is made from filamentous fungi, but then you could have a coating on that material, or you have the cells produce aspects or things that are on the surface, and the surface properties give it maybe a longer lifespan. So, maybe it's going to break down over time, but maybe the time scale's 10 years, right? Or 5 years. I don't know about 20 or 100 years. So I don't know if you'd want to make something that you would expect to persist for 20 years out of mycelium materials.
Yeah.
There are other really exotic applications we've thought about, and I don't think I was the first one to think of this. We've heard others talk about it, but the atmosphere on Mars has a lot of carbon dioxide and nitrogen. So here's a crazy idea. You can't put bricks in rockets. They're too heavy. You can't launch bricks to take to Mars. So yeah, if you're going to build a structure on Mars, in The Martian, the movie, they were all inflatable. That's fine, temporarily. But if you want to build a structure, you got to get the building materials from Mars. So how do you do that? Well, you could launch 3 cultures. So one culture could be nitrogen-fixing bacteria that change N2 nitrogen into metabolizable nitrogen. You could launch a algae, which converts carbon dioxide into fermentable sugar. And you could launch fungi, which would then consume the nitrogen and consumable carbon from these bacteria to make a lot of fungi that you could put into bricks, that you could make building materials.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so if I go to Mars, I'm taking you with me because it sounds like we'd be okay if you were there. So that's pretty rad. And so, and it also in the kind of the vein of like replacing plastics and kind of this global menace. I think the idea of creating food sources as well, especially meat-like products. I mean, that has a global effect as well, as far as like methane that's released, and just there's a lot of like controversy about how livestock are treated and animals are treated, and so a lot of that goes away, which I think is also just an incredible impact of your research. That's pretty phenomenal. And if humanity is tasked with subduing the earth, we're also tasked with taking care of it and kind of honoring this gift that we've been given. And so I love our conversation because it feels like science is the means to that. Science is one of the ways in which we not only subdue the earth, but we're caretakers of it.
Absolutely.
And so I just thank you so much for coming on and sharing, just having a conversation with me, and hopefully it's been beneficial to our LifePoint family and those outside of our LifePoint family. But yeah, let's go subdue and rule.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome.
Thanks, Brad.
Yeah.